So the B-17 Flying Fortress is a very iconic aircraft from World War II. In addition to being a very iconic aircraft, it's one that has a special place in my heart. My father and I built a few models when I was younger, usually World War II era aircraft or battleships, and one of these aircraft was the B-17, and this is one of those models that probably occupied a better part of our time when it came to the model building, and the one we actually built was an F model, but with the absence of that in this game, the G is going to be the closest to it. Now there is another B-17 that is available in game, and that would be the B-17D. But the B-17D was a very early generation version of this airframe, and you'll note a major discrepancy or a major weakness with this aircraft as you are grinding up through this line if you are so inclined. And that is that the tail gunner does not exist on this airframe. The additions that made the B-17 Flying Fortress a real Flying Fortress really culminated with the G, and let's highlight some of those changes visually when we look at this airframe. The first and most obvious visual change is going to be the fact that the tail now has this very distinct rounded vertical stabilizer that we all have known and loved for the B-17. But the B-17D has a much more truncated version with a much more rapid incline and a much shallower or a much more truncated elongation to this vertical stab. And if you have the D, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. In addition to that is going to be the tail gunner. The D comes to just a point in the back, which means that you don't actually have a firing arc directly behind you. In fact, you don't even have any turrets on the D whatsoever. The B-17G has a belly turret with two 50 cal Mark II machine guns in it. However, the Delta version of this airframe will have more of a waist belly gunner, and he can only fire in a downward angle and probably, I think it's like a 50-degree arc behind him. I could look up the stats, but it's much more limited than you would with a 360-degree ball turret like you see here. You still have the two 50 cal waist gunners, although they're oriented a little bit differently, and you still have this spine gun right here, and then the dorsal ball turret. It was non-existent on the Delta version, as well as this chin turret that's located here. Now there was still a 50 cal that was mounted inside the glass of the bubble canopy in the front that did allow for another 50 cal machine gun to fire out the front of the Delta version, but the major limitation for the Delta would be the fact that this spine gun right here in the center of the airframe, as well as that kind of belly waist gunner, the belly waist gunner could kind of fire directly behind the aircraft for the most part, but there was an actual blind spot if you were looking straight back on the airframe that kind of mirrored what you see for the horizontal stabilizer in the back. So if an aircraft was to come in kind of on a slightly downward angle from above you, he would actually be completely obscured from any of your fields of fire, which meant that you weren't going to get any benefit from any of those defensive fire expertise that you may have in your gunners, and you were going to get chewed up with no real way to be able to put the damage back on the enemy. But when you look at the G, you'll see that there's quite a few turrets and machine guns mounted on here that can definitely put some hurt on the enemy, and as long as you have the enemy off to either the left or the right of the vertical stabilizer, you can take advantage of the tail gun, the belly ball turret, as well as the dorsal ball turret, getting a total of 650 cals on the enemy aircraft coming towards your airframe, which is more than enough in most cases to be able to keep the enemy at bay, or at the very least make them regret coming up to face your aircraft. Now, if someone really wants to take out your bomber, they can with some dedication, but they're going to pay for it. So bear that in mind, that you're not going to win every engagement when it comes to an air-to-air fight with this airframe, but you do have the potential to really make them pay for it, and that's the best that you really can do with this airframe. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to get into some gameplay, and I may make a few comments here and there, but for the most part, I think I'm going to be focusing on my play. So I'll see you guys in the battle.
Attention! You are entering the combat zone. Get ready for battle. Good luck.
Alright, so what I usually like to do at the very beginning of any of these matches is I plan according to the layout of each one of these sites. You get a total of 16 bombs dropped in 2 volleys of 8. These are 500-pound bombs, and they are pretty substantial and able to take out pretty much any target, but they are going to be fired in these strips, so you're going to need to make sure that you move as quickly as possible. By hitting the Alt button, I can kind of see the orientation of how the ground site is laid out, although, oh, there it is, it just spawned, and I try to line myself up on attack where I'm actually going to be able to take out 4 pieces of ground equipment. Now that's going to also include AA, so if you can see here, I'm going to try and position the aircraft a little bit closer to what I think the path is going to be. And there you can see I'm intersecting 2 AAA pieces as well as 2 major ground targets, and that is going to be my route of travel for this bombing run. I can make some slight adjustments, but since the B-17 is a much more sluggish airframe and not nearly as maneuverable as your A-26 would be, you're going to find that you're going to have very limited ability to adjust your bomb release when you're over the target. I will throttle up as I approach the target because it's not going to take too much to be able to take out those AAs. As long as I can at least nick it with some bombs, we'll be good. But it's going to take a little bit more deliberate effort to line up on some of these major ground targets. Oh. Hopping into my tail gunner, I am now going to be taking on some enemy aircraft, trying to use that to finish flipping the zone.
Enemy bombers inbound. Don't let them reach their target. Rocket has reached the target. Enemy objects damaged.
Well, and that's the power of the 8 bombs landing on the target. I would like to go after that mining plant, but in the meantime, I think I'm going to take advantage of the positioning of these bombers over here. I'm actually going to operate as a bit of a gunboat, and at least try and help out a little bit.
The threat to the complex eliminated. Way to go! We have complete control of the skies. Way to go! The enemy has taken over the command center. Immediate counterattack required. Receiving reports about rapidly deteriorating weather conditions. Support will be unable to reach you. Do you read me? Over. They've almost got us. We cannot support you any longer. The storm is too heavy. Do you copy? Over.
AA can be some of the largest hindrance to this airframe, to any of these airframes. They're very large. I'm not sure if AA was buffed in the patch updates, but it definitely can put a serious hurt on the airframe, and you can overcome that a little bit with the camo options. It turns out that now the camo options will give you a certain amount of protection from AA fire, as well as decreasing your chances of being able to be spotted, so there is some advantages to be had there. But there you have it. That is the B-17G in all of its glory. This is a fully spec'd out and upgraded specialist airframe. I think I'm probably going to swap out from the gun laying drive to probably going with either turret gun sight or turret armor protection. You probably saw I lost a few gunners here and there, but the med kit pretty much takes care of that. I think it'll probably be a lot more advantageous to be able to get guns on target earlier, so that way I can start benefiting from defensive expert as soon as possible. So it is going to be a little bit more hands-on than it would be if you were to just allow them to be passive gunners, but I feel as though if you're going to be operating with passive gunners in a slow kind of lazy bomber like this, you're already being way too lazy. You might as well take advantage of the opportunity, hop into the turrets, you got tons of time, and shoot down some aircraft as well as drop some bombs. It is also going to make the gameplay a little bit more interesting, especially when you're in some of those dynamic environments like over an enemy capture zone with a lot of AA fire coming in. Apologize for the voice and maybe some coughing there. I do have a cold right now, but sorry, but thanks again for tuning in. I hope you guys like the content.